So which follows nicely to this one. So again, politics. But for me, this does really resonate with somebody who's in the enterprise, because if you're in an enterprise, you need to understand the politics because it is going to affect you. This is an example. Lots of people doing this. The EU's introducing regulation around particularly things like scoring, decision systems. A number of representatives here pushing a bill. It's not been passed, but this is, I think, the second time they've tried to push it through. Again, looking at transparency and oversight of algorithms, particularly those obviously that touch consumers. That's generally the first area that's being looked at in terms of consumer protection, which makes total sense. But what I think is really interesting if you're in the enterprise is not just looking at this as an interesting piece of news, but looking at this as your decision systems can become a liability. And so you need to understand risk, because once this crosses over from being something you should be taking care of to something that's legislated, it can cross over either into the regulatory space or the legal space, and then it's on your plate. And so you need to really understand if this is coming, because if it's coming, you need to get your house in order now before you have to go and clean up your stuff that's 2 years old. So this stuff is definitely coming, especially if you're in a regulated area. But even if you're not in any general area, looking at what the EU is doing, it is coming. So have a strong focus on using technology that can automate these kind of processes, like taking out any kind of discrimination. Don't rely on people. Buy the technologies. Lots of great companies working on this. IBM's got some great stuff, but there are systems that are people building some. I think I might show one here, where you can buy a system that will do this automatically, and they're improving rapidly. So if you can take a look at some of those, I think that's well worthwhile.
I have a couple of thoughts. I have a number of thoughts on this. So there's this big, sort of hue and cry around AI bias right now. And often it's lacking the context that humans are the most biased and worst, at making decisions. And, we cause our own problems, and our processes and our human biases cause these problems and have for, forever, for the history of business. And so AI bias really just takes all of the data and sort of the prior assumptions, sticks them in a model, and then it kind of carries on the bias in the same way that the language systems read the internet and then turned out to be biased and racist and all sorts of things that we don't want. So they just sort of carry forward what we put in them, garbage in, garbage out, a little bit.
So that kind of flows over into this one. So,
good find. I saw that.
Yeah, a third of business. I actually would call BS on this. I don't really buy that. Although, and I've read the report too. It also said half
a third of businesses, or a third of businesses customers, is what I would ask.
A third of businesses believe that they've suffered some damage, given the state that almost no businesses have anything out there doing anything. I brought this up as a counterpoint to say, be careful of what you read, because lost revenue 62%. I would really like to see your methodology for how you work that one out, and I think we need to be very careful when it comes to AI bias, to be really focused on what we're actually trying to solve and what's important. There was some interesting stuff in here, and interestingly, this was done by
DataRobot,
a vendor who's got technology that solves AI bias.
Surprise!
Would you believe? Now, I just talked there that earlier that I like technology that solves AI bias, so I'm all in favor of that. But I'm all not in favor of those people producing a report that gets spread without criticism across the internet, because this is such a charged area. and goes off in all sorts of directions. So just be a little bit cautious about what you read and study.
It's a very interesting angle, because this is clearly saying that they surveyed a bunch of business customers, and then that the businesses are saying they lost revenue, customers, and employees because of harm from AI algorithms. That's generally not the narrative. The general narrative is people are losing access to loans or housing, or it's more about the impact at the personal level. It's really funny for me to see that a bunch of businesses are crying and saying, "Oh, we need regulation," which never happens. They don't demand more regulation, generally speaking. So for them to be saying that they are being impacted, it's unusual for me. It's not something I generally see in the space. I would definitely like to dig into the report and read it.
Yeah,
but
so
again,
that's interesting. It says, how does it say? A big percentage want more regulation, but then if you look at the report, it says 45% think regulation will harm innovation, 44% think it will harm speed. So be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, it's a weird one. I would like to actually read the source of that report.
It's a bit of a strange one.
Yeah.
But they do have a product that automates the process of taking out. I hate the word bias, because AI is supposed to be biased.
Right. Actually, can you just focus on, actually share that thought? Because you and I have had this conversation, and I think this is a really key thought.
It's
bias
kind of ridiculous.
It's a funny word, right? Because it's not understood well I would say widely, what the true definition of bias and what the role of bias is in AI models. Could you just unpack that for a sec? Because I think it's really important.
So there's a couple of things. What we're really focused on in the first instance is having AI algorithms that don't break the law. And particularly in Western countries, not all countries, I work with many countries where these won't apply. Some of those discriminations are not part of their law, but in most Western countries or G7 countries, whatever, certain things are law. And so of course you don't want to break that law. So you don't need to say, don't be biased. It's breaking the law. AI in most cases is a system to bias. It's making decisions, this or that, A or B, 1 or 2, 0 or 1. It's meant to choose. That's what it does. The crux of where this all came from is that, as you noted earlier, people build algorithms based on the data they have. And the data they have is from us people, and we are biased. So your data that you have, your historical data, is almost certainly got all sorts of bias. Some things that were actually maybe lawful when the data was produced, but are not now. Some things that were relevant when it was produced, but are not now. So if all you've got to build your models is that historical data, you're walking into a minefield. And that's really the key point that gets obscured by all this, which tends to shoot off in the social justice warrior direction and completely obfuscates the real point, which is your data may not be fit for purpose, and it may cause you stuff that causes your business harm. So here are the things you need to be careful of. Here are the technologies that can actually read your data and try and make you aware of that. That's what we need to be focusing on, not just this focus on particularly bias and ethics, because when you come to ethics, that's really a question of almost politics. Should you be ethical? Well, we would like to think you are, but it's not a technology question. It's a question of your business, not your technology. And so the whole area gets so muddled when it's actually very clear. If you focus on don't break the law, don't break regulation, don't break your company values. So it's law, regulation, and values. And can you get some technology that will actually help you do that? But understand, if you're setting off now building all these models with all the data you've got, that data is full of all sorts of stuff you probably don't want. And you probably don't know it's in there. And there are also some things that can trip you up that you don't realize. They do mention one thing in the report about, for example, postcodes or zip codes. They can actually cover information that you don't realize, like racial segregation. So you might actually be saying, oh, if you're from this zip code, you're good for a loan. Well, but the system doesn't realize that that's because those codes are segregated and those people are affluent. Is that what you want? You actually may want that depending on what your use case is. So you need to also understand, you've got to look at that and say, well, what are the things we want and what are the things we don't want? And then take out those things you don't want.
Yeah, it's a very muddy area. There's a lot happening, I think, policy-wise. Let's go back to basics. There's a semantics issue here, which it seems like there always is at the root of these things when you and I talk. There's a general understanding of what do these terms mean. There's clarity around those things. In other words, is this a gray ethical area, or is this a hard black and white, you may not discriminate, if you do, you're legally culpable? Which you're saying, I think a lot of the time, a lot of these things they're not fuzzy at all. They're simply, are you making a system that makes a prediction that breaks the law? If you are, then you need to fix it, and you need to head it off and not create that system in the first place. And then I think there's the technical, well, how do we make this happen conversation? There's a lot happening in that field. I'm talking to a lot of companies in the space. What I would broadly call kind of observability, but inside there, you could talk about governance, risk, compliance, let's say explainability, responsible AI. There are a lot of terms being thrown around, and there's a lot of technology being applied to those problems right now to do things like, the traditional narrative was all AI models are black boxes. That's not actually true. They can explain themselves. If you use certain models in certain data, they can be explainable, and they can explain themselves and say, oh, the reason I approved this loan is these 3 numbers fit inside these bands. And if that's true, then I approve the loan. Right. So that stuff can be made human readable, essentially.
So that's the explainable part. And that for me is the key word. We get mixed up with this responsible and ethical. It's actually the explainable that's the key. You need to be able to understand it. And as you said, many can. Increasingly, I think, to their credit, because of all this press about this area, it's become an area of focus for vendors too. They want to make sure everything is like that, and it will increasingly become more and more and more explainable, because what is for me always critical is transparency.
Yes,
whatever you decide to do with it is up to you and you working within the law. But in order for you to make that decision, it has to be transparent, and that really is the key.
Yeah. And I think that people don't understand that that's possible. And you can make these things human explainable and say, these were the numbers, these are the criteria, these are the thresholds, hence this was the decision taken. Now, then you have something to argue about. Well, would humans make that decision? Is that the correct decision? Was it the legal decision? Was it the ethical decision? If not, then we can go back and rethink how we're approaching this. And all of that is becoming a lot more clear as we go forward. And there's a lot of technology and a lot of work being done in this space to make this more transparent and more discussable and debatable, so that companies can be on the right side of these lines, whether those are ethical or legal lines.
Yeah, and I think what's really critical to understand when you get into this conversation is human decisions are not explainable. They're made up. When you ask someone after the fact, that person makes it up, because particularly for a complex decision, the stuff's all in your head. It's all automatic. We don't actually have access to be able to run off an explanation of that. Right. An AI system potentially can. So we are in a position where we're potentially moving to a meta system that is much more explainable than our current system.